Welcome, everyone. Please come on in. I know it took some time to get the food, so I want to get us started. So if you're my son and lingering at the door, feel free to come in. All right, I'm so thrilled and excited that tonight you all get to learn with one of my teachers, Professor David Kraemer. Professor David Kraemer has been running the library at JTS, which maybe you'll tell us a little bit about over the course of this conversation, in case we run out of things to talk about, but also has been a professor of Talmud and rabbinics at the Jewish Theological Seminary for many years, which is how we first met. I understand that you've really been teaching there for many decades. Dr. Kraemer's...
At least 8. Yeah.
Your focus has been on the literary analysis of rabbinic literature, rabbinic ritual, and the social and religious history of Jews in late antiquity and Jewish diaspora ideologies. You've written so many books that have had such a profound impact on our understanding of our own Jewish tradition, including your work, several books on the Talmud, which I have found particularly useful as I've been teaching this new Talmud class here at IKAR. Dr. Kraemer is a prolific author and commentator. In addition to the many books that he's written, he's also written a lot about Ezra and Nehemiah, about the Mishnah, about other subjects. It's really an incredible honor and a joy to have you, such a scholar, here to talk with us tonight about your new book called Embracing Exile, The Case for Jewish Diaspora, which came out just a couple of months ago. This beautiful book. And so I will just say that about a week ago, this book was listed by The New Yorker as one of the 100 notable books of the year, which is pretty incredible. And what's more, it seems to have been met with the approval of Professor David Myers, which is, I think, a harder bar to reach, who wrote the following: both the Catholicity, is that right, David? of perspective and a sterling track record. And actually what reads as almost an ecstatic endorsement from David Myers is it is a compelling read. And so I really think there's nowhere else to go from here. I want to invite you to share with us really the thesis of the book, but I want to frame it through talking a little bit about stories. And, you know, we tell stories not necessarily to reflect reality, but to support the reality that we hold, and even to build a reality. And as you write in this book, we have, as a Jewish people, have developed ideologies of diaspora over the course of 2,000 years because we were driving to seek meaning in diaspora. And you share that the dominant narrative of Jewish history in the diaspora is what you really call the canonical history of the diaspora, is that we have essentially experienced an unending sequence of sufferings as strangers in foreign lands. And essentially, we went from exile to crusades to pogroms to gas chambers. That's the Jewish conception of what diaspora is. But of course, this is only partial and incomplete. And your book tells another story that you say is at least equally true, which is a story of Jewish flourishing in the diaspora. And I wonder if you could start by talking about these two stories, what it means for our people to choose one version of a story and then make that the dominant narrative that we tell. And what's the story that you are adding to the canon that you would like us all to leave here tonight holding as potentially at least equally valid to the story that we all grew up hearing?
Wow. Thank you for that question. Great to be here. And I got to say, we are thinking along exactly the same lines as I was sitting there with the various nigunim, and trying to refine the way I would respond to any question. I began to think about the different stories. And I think that actually they're not 2 narratives, but 3 narratives. And so I'd like to very, very quickly, briefly share about that. The canonical narrative is the one that you just defined, but just to put it in chronological terms, and you put it in these terms, I think unintentionally, but you can respond and let me know. We often tell the story of Jews having a kingdom, dwelling on their land. There was, it's true, a first exile back in the Babylonian era, but it didn't last all that long. Jews came back, lived on their land, and then 2,000 years ago, and that number 2,000 is canonical, and we hear it all the time, and we sing it in Hatikva, and I mean literally, you'll hear it from every Jewish commentator over and over and over again. At that point, an exile diaspora began, and Jews began to suffer endlessly, right? That ended, you mentioned the Holocaust. Ending is a complicated question, but we can talk about that. And then we came and we established, once again, after 2,000 years, an independent entity, an independent Jewish state in the land of Israel, right? So that's the canonical story. That canonical story, with all of its power, is historically speaking largely incorrect. Okay, so let me tell the second story, right? So the second story is a story that notices that that Babylonian exile that I just went over very quickly, because in that first version of the story it doesn't have much impact, is actually crucial for the history of Jews and Judaism. It's actually the beginning of people we might call Jews and the beginning of Judaism itself. How so? Right? Because with that exile, at least an equal number of Jews always lived in exile diaspora. From that exile until the present day, when we could talk about the demographics of the numbers in Israel and here, but certainly until the late 20th century, the vast majority of Jews through the ages have lived in diaspora. So when the Romans fought the wars with the Jews and defeated the Jewish armies and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70, right, that wasn't the beginning of diaspora. Right? The diaspora had existed already for centuries, and there were important Jewish communities in that diaspora. Moreover, it was not the beginning of a new exile, because the Romans did not have a policy of exile. Right? They took prisoners, the way armies do, prisoners of war, but Jews continued to live in the land. The land was not emptied of Jews, right? Now, it's true that the center of the population moved to the Galilee, but it was a vibrant Jewish community that continued to live in the land of Israel, producing the Mishnah, producing the Jerusalem Talmud, producing Midrash, creating a new form of Judaism that could flourish after the destruction of the temple. But then the Babylonians took hold and began a Judaism that was portable and, yes, subject to the difficulties and hardships that we know as part of the story, but what people has not experienced hardships simultaneously. And this brings me back to the library, because one of the things that I have witnessed with this amazing collection we have at the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is arguably the best collection of rare Judaica, at least when we're talking about manuscripts, Jewish manuscripts, in the world. It's just absolutely remarkable. And when you see these works, there's no way you can imagine that Jews only lived impoverished and oppressed and, and being chased from one place to the other. On the contrary, right? You see art that is magnificent. You see wealth. You see peaceful existence. You see creativity. This too was part of the Jewish story, and it continued throughout all of these ages. So when we talk about the Jewish people and even Judaism, right? They are, to very significant extents, we are, to a very significant extent, a diaspora phenomenon. The Jewish people is a diaspora people to a significant extent. Judaism, in many of its most important aspects, originated in diaspora. There would be no Judaism as we know it without that. And now the third story. So what story did we tell ourselves about our existence? Remarkably, if you look at the breadth of our canonical literature, you will find time and again that we tell a story about a people who wanders and our God wanders with us. And think of the significance of that. We are not without God. We are not alone wherever we go. Whether we begin with the story of the Exodus from Egypt, when the tabernacle, portable home of God, goes wherever we go, right? Or whether we talk about the first exile and the second exile, it wasn't an exile, but let's label it that for these purposes, that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, goes with Israel wherever Israel finds itself, to Hasidic teachings, which say the land of Israel actually wanders with us. If we pray properly, with full intent, and find ourselves in the hills of Galicia, right, in southeastern Poland, right, if we pray with fervor, right here, tonight, right? So I'm going to tell you. Right over here is the land of Israel, according to the Hasidic teachings. Because if you pray with fervor and intention, right, then you bring the land of Israel with you. That is that teaching. And this notion of God following us, of even the land following us wherever we go, this is a recurrent theme that follows what I've just described as our third narrative. Goes far beyond that as well, but it's powerful and unremitting.
I hope people understand how controversial this is and how important it is for us to hear what you're saying and how important this book is for us. And I want to talk a little bit about your journey to get to this place. And then we're going to get to some of those examples of the prophet Ezekiel and Jeremiah. And really, I want to talk to you about some of the biblical and Talmudic texts that bring. And then just to give a sense of the arc, and then what the implications are. Like, what does it mean to be a Jew in the diaspora in this moment when the narrative that we've been telling for a couple of millennia is the narrative of that diaspora/exile is a place of suffering and that the land of Israel is the only place where Jews can truly thrive. So, my kids in their Israel Ed class, which is like the advanced level class that they take at Shalhevet in 11th grade. The canonical text there is Hanan Alexander's article on mature versus romantic Zionism. And it's a big piece of the education at Shalhevet is really thinking about how Israel education for diaspora Jews has really been first and foremost about falling in love. And the problem is that it usually ends there. And that when it comes to actually building a real mature relationship, we don't do a good job in the diaspora teaching people how to engage Israel seriously. And so there's a kind of shocking awakening that happens for people who are willing to ask those questions. Other people just don't ask the questions and continue with their lifelong romance with Israel. And so I was thinking about Hanan Alexander's piece when I read the very beginning of the book. You talk about your journey and how you had junior year abroad in Jerusalem, like I did, and like so many of us, I think many of us did. And you actually, I mean, yours is pretty amazing. You were there when the day the Cardo was discovered, and I mean, you're part of history unfolding before our eyes. And there's a romance to that and an attachment that develops. And so many young American Jews go and study, and then something happened to kind of mature your relationship, which I think led you on this journey to spend many decades doing this research. Can you talk a little bit about that journey away from the kind of romantic attachment towards something that brings to the forefront a very different narrative?
Yeah, so just one short additional word on the romance. I mean, it really did begin with romance. And I had the privilege, just absolutely remarkable life experience of the year that I was on my junior year abroad in Israel, living in what was then the newly rebuilding Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. Right, so I lived in the old city, I mean, literally, I remember the day when there was screaming out on the street, the narrow streets, if you can imagine, of the old city of Jerusalem, screams of excitement, and I went running out to see what's going on, and people say, you gotta come and see this, right? So I go running down, and there was the Byzantine road, the Cardo, which had been uncovered for the first time in those many, many centuries. And that's only a small example, right, of the kind of thing I experienced then. And of course, how could you not fall in love under those circumstances? So what leads to the end of that kind of romance, right? Naive love? You discover the reality. And what I mean by that is that I think a significant part of what led me in different directions was quite simply the move that began to develop in the wonderful historical studies that were being conducted by a very flourishing academic world, the world of academic Jewish studies, where you can't simply accept the canonical story. You can't simply accept that myth. And by here I mean myth in both senses of the term. It's a story that has power. That is what myths do. But in addition, it omitted a lot, right, that myth. And so the recovery, the willingness to look more bravely at the diversity of Jewish experience through history, since I was being faced with that again and again and again, you couldn't accept the old story. It just didn't work anymore. Now that's part of it. The other thing is, and this has been an important part of every project that I've been involved in, you begin to see, when your eyes are open, all kinds of things that don't make sense in light of what you thought you knew, right? So when I came back from that junior year, I actually devoted myself, in my romance, I wrote a senior honors thesis on the commandment to settle the land of Israel in rabbinic literature, right? So what I thought I was doing was proving that every Jew has to move to Israel, right? That was, honestly, that was what underlied that project. But the major text in the Talmud that discusses this, the Babylonian Talmud, reflecting the diversity of opinion, but really a direction, an inclination in the Babylonian rabbis' discussion of this, the texts which quoted individually, right, which say things like, anyone who lives in the diaspora as though worships idols, right, that's only a slight retranslation of the teaching, right? You see that, and then you look at the way the discussion develops, and you notice that, lo and behold, that teaching is undermined by the Babylonian rabbis because they're very unhappy with it. And the conversation ends with a statement by a Babylonian rabbi who says, anyone who lives in Babylonia, it's as though you live in the land of Israel. Okay, it literally goes the opposite direction. So when you begin to see these contrary teachings, you say, wait a second, there's something here that I didn't learn, my teachers didn't share with me, and I've got to pursue it, I've got to uncover it, and I've spent all of those years. Some people, look at the publication of this book, I mean, it appeared officially May 1st of this year, and say, oh, this is a post-October 7th publication. It's not a post-October 7th publication. It's something that I've been working on for many, many years, and it's only an accident of delays with the publisher that led to it to be published during this time. Now, I have to tell you, I'm not sorry that it's been published now, because I think it's, I always thought that this topic was important, but now I think it's more important than ever.
I agree that it's more important than ever now, and you definitely, there's an audience now that's eager to hear what you have to say. And I do remember also when I was in seminary, there's a supremacy to the idea of living in Israel versus in diaspora. It feels like, even the language of aliyah, you're going to go up, like or yeridah, you're going to go down and live in the diaspora. And I was teaching last week the Gemara from Bava Kama 117, about Rav Kahana, who comes from Bavel because he kills a man in the Beit Midrash, and he's like impulse control issues. And so Rav sends him to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel, where he's sitting in Rabbi Yochanan's yeshiva. And Rabbi Yochanan is he's the great sage of Eretz Yisrael, the greatest. And Rav Kahana immediately outsmarts him, and he's operating at a different level than even Rabbi Yochanan. And it closes with Rabbi Yochanan saying, everything that you thought I knew, they know better. It's and now it's of course the Bavli, it's the Talmud that's written in the diaspora that's telling the story of the supremacy actually of the diaspora over the Jewish community in the land of Israel. But it's interesting because of course most people today who aren't Talmud scholars, but most of the the Amaretz or the regular people, we're studying the Bavli, right? That's the normative text to study. So there's something powerful about that, like putting a stake in the ground, that actually diaspora can lead to a kind of flourishing of Jewish creativity, generativity, ideas. And I want, if it's okay, actually, I'm going to take one step back before we go into the text, because I wanted,
Okay, but before you do that, I
Yeah.
just want to add one thing. So there are many stories of the sort you just described, which describe the superiority of Babylonia when it comes to Torah. And if we recognize that Judaism is fundamentally about Torah, then that is an amazing statement. That Babylonia or other diasporas ultimately are the center of Torah. And here, this is a wonderful rabbinic teaching, says very simply, right, that in the land of Israel, they forgot the Torah, and Ezra came up from Babylon to remind them of it.
Wow.
Okay? Then the Torah was forgotten again in the land of Israel, and Hillel, you know the famous Hillel, the Babylonian, came up from Babylonia to teach it to them again. And then they forgot it a century later. I mean, it's amazing, right? And then another Babylonian rabbi came up to remind them of them. And it's interesting because this literally reverses what we're accustomed to say, right? We have been taught to say, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah. For out of Zion the Torah will emerge. And what this teaching says is, no, out of Babylonia comes the Torah.
which means that there should be a reverse birthright so that Israelis come and learn from the amazing davening in America. So I was talking to Rabbi Panitz about this earlier, and not sure if I would have the courage to share this with you, but I am going to tell you this experience that I had. I was at a multi-faith clergy fellowship retreat several years ago before October 7th. And we did this exercise. There are 15 of us in this clergy fellowship. And we did a multi-hour exercise in which we were asked one question: where are you from? No, really, where are you from? And first, everybody had to be quiet for 20 minutes, which is hard for me to begin with. But with a hard question like that on the table, especially. And by the time the first person spoke, everybody was crying. And people started to share one by one where they were from, no, really where they were from. And so one of the black pastors in the group spoke first, and he talked about how he's from Chicago, but really he's from Alabama. But really he's from Africa. And talking about his family's journey, and each of those moves meant. And one of the Palestinian Muslim women in the group spoke about the olive tree in her grandfather's, behind her grandfather's home outside of Jerusalem, that was planted by her great-great-grandfather. Like a real sense of where you are from. And what occurred to me that I couldn't fully understand, but I felt it so clearly, was that I came from exile. I had this sense, like that was the word, not diaspora, but exile, because first I thought, well, I'm from New York, obviously. And then I thought, I'm not really from New York, I'm from New Jersey. And then I thought, but like, we're not really.
Livingston, right?
Yeah.
I'm from Livingston, too.
Oh.
Me too.
Wow. So are
Dead
they,
Ross
right
too.
there.
Oh, look at that. Okay, maybe it is home after all. And then I thought, no, I'm really from Poland. And then I'm like, no, I'm not from Poland. I'm from the land. But like, my sense of home is the movement itself from place to place. And as I was reading your book, I was thinking about that I didn't associate exile only with pain. I associated it with fluidity and movement. And I'm a part of all of these things and all of these places. And so I want to ask you if you can. First of all, why do you choose exile instead of diaspora as the language? Because we generally do think of exile as a kind of negative thing, whereas diaspora's parv, like, but exile's fleish. And so, like, it's like a little, like, why? You don't have at all a negative resonance to exile. And in that moment, in this deeply spiritual, I don't know what was happening to me, but I had that kind of emotional reaction, and I wasn't scared of exile. I felt like actually defined in some way by the experience and united with all of the people, of all the Jews from all the different places, even the ones that didn't come from New Jersey, that we all are united by the fact that we are also a part of the story of exile. So how did you find and choose exile to be a term not of,
Yeah.
yes,
I
you got it.
I get it.
Okay, go.
So I mean, I use them essentially interchangeably. I comment on the common understanding of the difference in their connotation, exile being negative and diaspora being more neutral, as you say. I intentionally use them with fluidity, interchangeably, because I have grown comfortable and I want to promote exile as not just a negative, as a positive as well. Now, it's not just a positive, because nothing human is just a positive, right? Yeah. But exile shares in that. It has its negative experiences, but it has a lot that's positive as well. And I mean, it's funny that you said, and it goes back to the land, but no. It goes back to Transjordan, yes, from which God had to tell Abraham and family, leave your home, your father's house, your. That's where you come from. And you've got to be exiled before you can begin. Mm-hmm. And of course, human history requires exile before we begin, from the garden. And human life in its maturity and fullness requires exile. You've got to leave home. Yeah. Before you begin. That is the human fate. That is the human condition, right? And it's hard to leave home, right? It comes with pain, but it is also magnificent to leave home. And it provides you with opportunities that you would never have had if you stayed where you were born.
I want to talk to you a little bit more about some of the hard parts of exile, which
Sure.
which you don't focus on in the book, but I think we have to be honest about, and in painting this picture. But first, I said that your book was really mind-blowing, and one of the things, if we can start to look into the text for just a moment, because you are first and foremost really a scholar of sacred Jewish texts, and what you describe about the book of Joshua, which reads like the sixth book of the Torah. So why is the Torah then only
5 books?
Chamisha Chumshei Torah, only 5 books of the Torah. Can you just speak to this and Yechezkel Kaufman's read of this?
Yes, I was good. Thank you for adding Yechezkel Kaufman.
Yes.
I can't take any credit for this. I learned from it. Do you want to finish?
No, I want you to finish.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, great scholar of Bible and of Jewish history, Yechezkel Kaufman, who made Aliyah, was a Zionist, right? Taught in Israel, really, and wrote a magnificent multi-volume work on the religion of ancient Israel. And one of his crucial observations, which for me was, you say, mind-blowing, I mean, I remember the first time I read it, was the simple recognition that the Torah ends before the end of its natural story, right? You may have, we've all seen the word Pentateuch, right, which is just a Greek translation of the 5 books, as in the 5 books of Moses. But you'll also find scholars who speak about the Hexateuch, the 6 books, which include the book of Joshua, because both in terms of the text, the style, the narrative, and so forth, the book of Joshua is a natural conclusion to the story that's told in the Torah, or so one might think. So the question is, why is the most sacred part of Jewish canon, the Torah itself, why does it end in exile, right? The 5 books of Moses, who never steps foot into the land that was promised. And Kaufman observes that according to biblical scholarship, and this is the common recognition of biblical scholarship, that the Torah as we know it, whatever the traditions that were inherited might have been, the Torah as we know it was actually formulated in the Babylonian exile. And what he observes is that the Torah affirms the experience of the exiles, because it says that they can live in exile and that life can operate at the highest level of sanctity possible. That's what the Torah teaches. You don't need to go into the land in order to live at the highest level of a sanctity.
Did you all get that? Yeah, yeah. It's very subversive. Right.
How is it legal?
How is it legal?
Okay. Well, because you've got a
Because-
marvelous leadership who've created an open environment,
Also,
right?
Ben-
And so it's actually possible to discuss things.
Also, Ben Gavir's police force has no power in these auspices, so we're okay for now. Listen, there's that is absolutely mind blowing to me, and it changes the way that we look at absolutely everything. And there's so many more stories here, and I warned you that we could talk for too long, and I want to make sure everyone gets out of here in time to go to sleep at some point, But in addition to really laying out both the many kind of breathtaking reads of Torah stories, foundational Torah stories, like the Joseph narrative, and reading the prophet Jeremiah telling us how to live in exile. You should plant your gardens and make a life for yourself and for your children, and then and really speaking to Joseph, to Esther, there's so many examples here. But I want to go back to the piece that you kind of hinted at earlier, which is the theological side of this. And you talked about how the Hasidim and others say that you can actually access God in diaspora, and some people say even better in diaspora than in the land. And you can even access Eretz Yisrael. You can even access the land itself. There's a theological dimension here that I think is really important for us, which is the statement that we have in our liturgy, which is "Mipnei chata'enu galinu me'artzenu," because of our sins we were exiled from the land, is a part of that first narrative that became canonical. That Jews sinned. Why was the temple destroyed? Because the first temple was destroyed because of idol worship. The second temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam, because Jews did something wrong, and so therefore we were kicked out of the land. That is part of the way that we tell our own story, and it's obviously a very painful and I think problematic theology that I would liken to, in some ways it's like Yisurin shel Ahava, or it's likened to the theologies of individual suffering that that the rabbis put forward, which seems to me is the rabbis trying to make sense of a world that makes no sense. And so in a way they're saying, well, even though we're in pain, we're suffering, we're far away from where we want to be individually or as a nation, it's our agency that led us here, so our agency therefore can help us return. But what it does is it's perpetuating an idea that if you sin, you will be sent away. The away is the place where bad things happen to you at the hands of the horrible other. And so the dream is that you can one day get right with God so that you can make it back into the land. And so I think it's putting forward not just a story, but it's laying out a series of objectives and behaviors that we should pursue if we want to not be hurting. Mm-hmm. Right. So I wonder, you speak to this a lot in the book, and I wonder if you can.
Well, there's so much to say in response to that. A couple of things. There's a book that I read not long ago by a professor at Union Theological Seminary, David Carr, called Sacred Resilience. And I knew kind of the basic thesis of the book, which you'll find elsewhere as well. But he expresses it in a way that's so clear that the biblical narrative written large, right, is remarkably a story that is recounted by the loser. Right? We often say that, history is written by the winners. Right? But the biblical narrative is history written by the losers. We lost, except that it gets wrong what it means to be a winner and what it means to be a loser. So commonly, when we say, history is written by the winners, what we mean is the people who triumph in war, right? Those who are more powerful. But there are other kinds of power, and there are other kinds of victories. And that is what our ancestors understood, and this was extremely important and extremely powerful, because what it said was, things don't just happen to us, even if they appear to be capricious, mean whatever. I mean, fill in all kinds of negative words there. Even if that's true, we've always got to ask ourselves, what's our responsibility in this? Right? And I would say that for every Jewish experience and every human experience, I think we would all be better off if we always asked, whatever else is going on, right, what's our responsibility? Right? So what that meant was something very, very interesting. It meant that history was not merely arbitrary. You can diminish this by calling it a rationalization, but what it also is a claim. Now, I'm going to shift our perspective on it, right? Reread it. So, if exile is a punishment, a divine punishment, then exile is evidence that God cares about us, right? Because, right? I mean, think about your relationship with the children of others. Your own children, right? If you see them misbehaving, you're going to try to correct them, right? The children of others, if you try to correct them, their parents are going to yell at you, right? And so it's the ones you love that you're going to try to correct. So this is actually a statement. Exile itself is a statement that God cares about you, that God loves you. Moreover, right, the way the Torah describes this is that if you do wrong on the land, you will be exiled, and exile will actually be the source of your atonement. Okay? So what this says, and I'm going to be very literal about this, that the land is the place where you pollute, and exile is the place where you're cleansed. Okay? And that is instrumental. The other thing I would add here is, if God sends you into exile, that of course means that our presence in exile is God's will. Now, just because being sent into exile was punishment doesn't mean that remaining in exile is punishment. That's a false equation. Remaining in exile may be God's will for other reasons, and that's part of what I explore in the book. There are many reasons that Jews understood it was important to be in exile as a fulfillment of God's will, and it wasn't, right, about punishment. At least that wasn't the center of it.
You know, you write that the dominant Zionist ideology is a negation of the diaspora, and you're seeking to sort of undo that work.
I want to fight that negation. That's correct.
And are you at the same time negating Zionist ideology, but when you do this kind of diaspora-centered, we can reach God better in the diaspora, all the great works of Jewish history, the great davening, the great communities, the better dinners, no, not the better food, right? I mean, but like, are you also negating that ideology of Jewish rootedness in the land, and the land being a place where we can reach a kind of closeness with God, a level of of Torah learning, of Jewish culture? You critique Echad Ha'am in the book, and I wonder how you would answer that.
Yeah, I critique Echad Ha'am for his naivete. I mean, I actually admire Echad Ha'am greatly, but the way he told Jewish history was, from our perspective, given more recent scholarship, just, wrong. And he was naive about what, creating a Jewish culture in the land would do for Judaism worldwide. There's a lot of romance there, right? And all romance collapses, into reality at some point, even if you preserve some of the romance. So, no, it is not a negation at all. It is meant to rebalance, right? It's meant to recover a powerful history and tradition that has not been part of the Zionist narrative, because Zionists, right, and many of us may fit into that category. I'm going back to right? I mean, I don't know any individuals, right, but this is not meant to be a negation of Zionism at all. But Zionists as ideologues, right, intended to support their position by telling the story in a certain way. That's the way all ideologies work. Zionism is no different in that respect than any other ideology, right? And I do object to the Zionist negation of the diaspora, which is not ubiquitous in Zionist thought and writing, but nearly so. I mean, the fact is that the tone of negation you find from the very beginning and continues to the present day, and that is what I take issue with, and what this book is meant to, be a recovery from, for the very simple reason that in my understanding of what it has meant to be a Jew and what it will continue to mean to be a Jew into the future, right, is not only the land of Israel, but also powerfully and every bit as importantly in the diaspora. That's what I see. So it's not a negation at all, right? It is actually an affirmation that if it were recovered not only in diasporas, but my hope is that this book will be read by a lot of people in Israel, right? And that some of them at least will not respond with immediate rejection, but will say there's something important here, and it's got to inform the way I think about what Israel is, what Zionism is, and what it means to be a Jew.
Because in fact, now, just like since the time of the Babylonian exile, first exile, that half the Jews in the world live there, and half of them live here in diaspora, and so, I'm thinking about Professor David Meyer's yearbook, the short history of the Jewish people, in which I hope I'm going to state this sufficiently, but this kind of paradox that the reason that the Jews have survived throughout history was because of these two countervailing trends. On one hand, anti-Semitism, and on the other, assimilation, which might strike you as very strange, because those are seen as great threats to the Jewish survival. But I believe your argument is that those two threats working against each other in a way create the perfect preservation of Jewish life, because we have been able to acculturate and assimilate into all kinds of environments around the world, and also never completely fully, because of the anti-Semitism rears its head, and we're reminded how we're other. And so this, I think, is your explanation of the experience. Am I right? Experience of diaspora, at least, and what struck me as I was reading you through the lens of David's analysis is, so in the land of Israel, when Jews living in Israel don't have they don't have the benefit of those forces in the same way, what happens? Like if Jewish survival is dependent on being in the kind of crucible in between these poles, like the push-pull of I love you, I hate you, so then what happens? And I think maybe post-October 7th, there's a different sense of that reality there, but it does make me wonder if that's the secret to our survival. What happens when we are not confronting those same forces?
So if you agree with those, and there are several of these whom I quote and do some analysis of in the modernity chapter of the book, if you agree with those who, in a similar fashion, say that the diaspora has been the source of great vibrancy, richness, where we have learned a lot. And I mean, what's wonderful, if you walk into the exhibition that we have from the library now at the Grolier Club Gallery in Midtown Manhattan, it's arranged geographically, and you walk through the galleries, you see how different Jewish creativity was in the different lands that we lived, right? If you were in Egypt, if you were in the Ottoman Empire, if you were in Iran and Iraq, if you were in Yemen, if you were in Germany, if you were in Spain, if you were in France, and so on. Go to all those. It's so radically different with its commonalities, and you look at all of this and you say, my God, it is thanks to these many homes that we have been so rich in our multiple but combined cultures. And if you agree with this, then there is a danger of getting too many Jews together in a small territory, right, for too long, right? Now, I'm not going to describe what the danger is, but I will. I remember when I read this was probably 3 or 4 years ago, was a column in Haaretz, the Israeli publication, and the headline of the article was, Israel, where Jewish languages go to die. Right? Because you've gotten homogenization, right? Yeah, I mean, yes, Yiddish is maintained, amongst religious communities. But when we're talking, Judeo-Arabic and Judeo-Persian and this and that, the many, many languages and the cultures that go with the languages, right? Culture inevitably goes with a language, right? The multiple languages that Jews have spoken, and you bring all of these diasporas together in fulfillment of the Zionist dream, and those languages die. And that is lamentable. Now, there may at the same time be something positive of that. We could discuss that. But with affirmation should come the strength, the courage to say, and you know what? While we do this, we also lose something. And it's worth maintaining the diversity of our diverse and spread cultures. That would be my view on it.
Wow. Okay, there's so much more to say here, and we have only about 5 minutes left.
Whatever.
So I'm gonna, I wanted, my brother is, who lives in Ra'anana, we talk a lot about the way that his shul navigates Jews, Sephardi, Mizrahi, and Ashkenazi liturgical differences. And in the Mourner's Kaddish, one of those liturgical differences emerges. And so if you are creating a more welcoming environment and you're generally Ashkenazi, but you want Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews to feel comfortable, you'll sort of pause and let them say their additional words and then keep going. But there's one rabbi who won't do it. He won't pause because he's Ashkenazi and he's going to do it the Ashkenaz way. And my brother is so upset about it because it feels not welcoming to all people. But from what you're saying, in a way, like the kind of blend that happens necessarily when we try to make space for everybody to be in this place, loses some of the like the distinctness of those different traditions, and why does one do this and the other one doesn't, and is there a way to preserve that? Okay, that's something for us to talk about another time. I think one of the harder questions that I was struggling with as I was reading the book is, yes, look at the richness, the complexity, the creativity, the beauty, the art, the culture, the science, the wisdom that has emerged from diaspora. And also, we took a trip to Eastern Europe as a community a couple of years ago, and we saw these gorgeous synagogues in Slovakia that are empty because all of those Jews were murdered. I mean, there's no one left. And Jews were in some of these towns 25%, 40%, 50% of the population. And they're gone. Like diaspora, exile didn't work for them. There was like an ad con. It works up to here, and then diaspora doesn't work anymore. And those few people who survived from those towns, they went the only place that they could go, which was to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel. So how do you hold that reality in addition to this kind of reclaiming the primacy of diaspora, or at least equalizing the necessity of diaspora in addition to Jews living in the land?
So, Pippic, Philip Roth, the doppelganger, in Operation Shylock, right? My problem with names, but I should remember Shylock, right? Operation Shylock, meets with Lech Wałęsa, and following that meeting, he wants to lead a restoration of Jews to their true homeland, Poland. Okay?
I know lots of people in New York who want the same thing for the
right,
Jews.
Exactly.
Not the Jews.
their true homeland, Poland. And he says, and I think this is very, very insightful, however we understand the literary function of the character, that it would be a tragedy to characterize hundreds of years of creativity and of, flourishing of Jews, in those lands who created Hasidism. I mean, where would we be today? Right, without Hasidism and neo-Hasidism and neo-Hasidism, and so, I mean, really, where would we be in the Jewish spiritual landscape without that? That came from Poland, right? And then I could go on and on to judge all of that on account of how many years, right? I mean, that would be wrong to do. Unfortunately, right, we live in the aftermath of the most, numerically, the most catastrophic event in Jewish history, which is a product of the most racist century in human history. Right? I mean, we think of, history as improving, that there's progress, right? Humans don't necessarily progress, right? There is nothing we got wronger, right, than the scientific racism of the late 19th into the 20th century. And Jews suffered as a product of that, certainly as much as any other population, and arguably more, but I don't want to get into comparative suffering, right? And that is the legacy with which we are left. But that, yes, we needed Israel at that time. We needed a place for Jews to go. Absolutely right. But simultaneously, I believe that it would be a tragedy for us to learn a lesson, which I think is an incorrect lesson, which is that that is the necessary outcome, right, of Jewish life in diaspora. Is October 7th the necessary outcome of Jewish life in the land of Israel? Right? I mean, we could discuss that, but it's a similar kind of statement. And I think that we need to be as resilient as we have always been, right? And one of the things I most like, and this connects to the book, but also back to the exhibition, one of the things that I most love about what I see in the exhibition is in our Spanish manuscripts, Iberian manuscripts. We've got the earliest ones, which are from roughly 1200 and later, so an early Talmudic manuscript, an early Bible manuscript, and then there's these magnificent manuscripts that were produced in Spain before 1492 in the 15th century. Now, we all know 1492 is a big Jewish date, but what we forget is that arguably more catastrophic than 1492 was 1391, which was the massive anti-Jewish, murderous riots, right, against Jews in Spain, right, which led to other things. But to see these manuscripts, the beauty, the creativity, the comfort, the wealth, all of which testify to Jewish resilience after setback, after catastrophe. I believe we are capable of that, wherever we live, and I believe it's essential to our future, and I believe that there is no one part of the Jewish world that has the capacity to support that resilience without the whole Jewish world.
Wow. Well, I want to just close this conversation by talking about what I think you have described as the dual orientation of the diaspora experience, which is, on one hand, a kind of ceaseless yearning for a return to home, to the land, but also the desire to build the richest, most beautiful, varied, connected life in the diaspora while we're waiting. And the problem emerged when the opportunity struck for people to actually, close the yearning gap. But if Jewish life is in some way built on an unfulfilled desire, and then we're able to actually establish a state and build life there and deal with all of the complexities and pains and heartaches that come with having power and having sovereignty. So then what's the new hope that keeps Jews alive, both in the diaspora and also in the land? And I mean that not in a kind of facile way, but in a real, I mean, if part of what defined us as a people was not only our resiliency, our ability to kind of overcome hardship, but our ability to hold a dream for something, for a different kind of future. So can you articulate what you see as a kind of, perhaps if not a unifying hope, then at least a hope that in the diaspora that we can hold as we navigate this challenging time?
Yeah, first of all, just a thing about that longing, okay? Just a small word about that longing and then about the dream. So the longing, Chaim Yerushalmi characterizes perfectly what it means to live with the hope and yet to be here, right? And he uses the terms exile and domicile, right? That what Jews achieved was to do both of those simultaneously. To have a sense that you were in exile, but simultaneously to domicile. That is to say, I am at home, fully at home. Even if you hope that one day, it will be returned. And let's not make a mistake, traditional Judaism would have forbidden Zionism, and its hope for return was not a hope that would be fulfilled by human beings in this history. It was a hope that would be fulfilled with the leadership of a messianic king, right, in the future. That's what those hopes meant traditionally. And Zionism, right, taking the initiative on the part of humans, was a radical movement in light of that, against the background of the tradition. Now, what's the dream? Yeah, the dream is to get to the Messianic age, right? And I believe in that dream, right? But what I mean by that is that I imagine that there will one day be a redeemed world, a redeemed future that I'd like to get to witness, if I'm resurrected at the time. But until then, it's something we have to hope for and work for, right? And that's our job as Jews, right? To hope for it. The hope is the work. The dream is clear. And part of what we do right here, right, on the Sabbath, right, to be perfectly honest about it, what is the Sabbath about? The Sabbath is creating an environment where everything we could possibly need is available to us. It's already here. We don't have to struggle for it. We don't have to labor for it. It's already here. Our meal is prepared. We don't have to travel anywhere because we're exactly where we need to be. All of those things. The Sabbath is the image of what we hope the whole world will be someday. And I don't mean literally every element of the Sabbath, but that is part of the dream we have created. And it's a noble dream, just to take one of many, many examples, which I'm sure you could fill in as quickly and probably better than I could, right? But the egalitarianism of the Sabbath command, right? The distinction between master and servant, between human and animal, disappears on the Sabbath because there is no class that should be working for any other class. So says the fourth of the 10 Commandments, right? And there are many other ways to express that.
Okay, we have to end, but I would really like to probe that and what it means to hold a messianic dream, but to know that the greatest threat to the state of Israel, maybe the Jewish people, is the messianists who take that dream very seriously and want to enact it now in our time.
I don't think they understand the dream. That's right?
But
no, it just has to be said. There is no more radical reform movement in the land of Israel than the radical messianists.
Wow.
That is the most extreme reform movement that exists in Israel today.
Okay, I just want to say thank you for reminding me why I so loved sitting in your classroom and what an absolute honor it is to learn from and with you. And thank you all for being a part of this. What a treasure you are. The book is called Embracing Exile by David Kraemer, The Case for Jewish Diaspora. Thank you so much, everyone. Shabbat Shalom.